Hello, everybody, and welcome to Patch and Crash, episode 8. It's the podcast where gaming culture and life collide. And today's topic is going to be a little bit of a controversial one. Since the last 15 years or so, the price tag of video games, especially console games, has been staying fixed at $60. With inflation and everything, and the buying power of the dollar, should games now cost more? We're going to talk about that. But before we do that, we have a little game we like to play, and it's called Play, Hate, and Miss. Mike?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. So what am I playing? I'm going back to my old Clash Royale. That is my everyday. I get my fix. But I'm also dipping my toes into a couple of games that you guys have previously had spent some time in. Gears Tactics, and then I don't know if you played Metro 2033, but I've just picked it up as part of the Game Pass. So that's what I'm playing right now. What am I hating on? Pop-up privacy. It doesn't, last week I think I said I hated on the internet, and this is like an iteration of that. It's like, no matter, I'd love that the GDPR was well intended and it wanted to protect this, but I feel like it's only made things worse because now I just get pop-ups, everything, and now I accept all because I'm just so tired of it. Yeah. And I'm sure that's worse for everybody. So I need an arbiter of my data that's not called Facebook. And then what am I missing on? You know what? I miss having a game that I have kind of fallen in love with. It's been a while. There's only about a half a dozen of those types of games in my life, let's call it in the last decade at least, where I've just fallen in love and I just burn time. Time just seems to kind of, it's timeless actually in some ways in my life at least, where I just spend so much time in it. And I haven't found like a game like that. It's been, very seasonal. I pick up a game, I play it for 10, 20 hours or so, and then I'm done with it. But nothing that I'll just, I'll kind of just sit in with. And so I'm kind of bummed about it, to be honest. I've got to find, I'd like to find a game that I'm really kind of interested in that I can, get back into in a really big way. So, but that's what I'm playing. That's what I'm hating. And that's what I'm missing on. What do you guys think? Polly, why don't you take it?
Sure. What am I playing right now? So last week Hans mentioned it, and I started picking up and playing a lot of it this week. It's Deep Rock Galactic. Pretty fun. I do enjoy co-op games immensely. I've been playing a little bit solo as well because it's just still addictive fun. Right. Nothing I'd say revolutionary about it, but it just feels good, and that's perfect. What am I hating on? Right now, I'm hating on the fact that there are too many games that I don't have time for. So, Mike, you mentioned Game Pass earlier. I grabbed every time they update and add in new stuff, which is I think once a month, if I'm not mistaken. I probably add 2 to 3 games to my library, and none of them are insignificant time sinks. So, to your point, actually, about finding a game that you fall in love with, I'm also searching for that, but I'm doing it through scattershot, just I was gonna get that game. Yeah, sure, I'll grab it because it's there, and finding the time is gonna be a challenge. And then what I'm hating on, in a fun reversal, I was going to say that I hate not being able to have co-op sessions with old friends and kind of really getting into solid co-op gaming. But that's no longer applicable because I had a lot of really good play sessions over the weekend with one of my best friends back home. Was up very late nights playing Deep Rock Galactic with him and shooting the shit. And that was a lot of fun, but it's too far and few between. So definitely wish I had more of that. Hans, yourself.
All right, cool. I've been away this week, so I've been off the grid, as they say. We rented a house in the countryside, and so I haven't really been playing games at all, but came back and I spent a couple hours over the weekend playing Enter the Gungeon, which is something that on the Switch actually, but it's available on a lot of platforms, and it's really good. I love roguelikes and roguelites, and I've played that game a ton when it kind of came out for the Switch, but I kind of found myself back into that game. So I've been on the Switch a little bit, and I saw that Cadence of Hyrule, it's a game there, which I love. And I love the developers behind that game, and I love, Crypto the Necrodancer, which is the other game they've made. But I hate the fact that they're putting out a season pass for DLCs on that game. And it's not really a season pass. They're calling it a season pass. It's 3 DLCs that are releasing from today to the end of October. So that's not really like a season, and it's just like 3 DLCs, and just call it like a pre-order for a bundle of DLCs. I mean, season passes when Fortnite does it, or I mean, I played the Division a bit. They have a really nice season pass, which you kind of level up in, and you get rewards various stages. This isn't the season pass; it's just bundles on a store somewhere. And kind of to tie into what you talked about, Mike, I'm missing the next Civilization game. Where is it? It's been 4 years, and there are a few games that are coming out. Soren Johnson has a game called, I wrote this down. Oh, it's called Old World, which is in early access on the Epic Store, which is kind of scratching that itch for me. And then there's a game coming out from the makers of Endless Space and Endless Legend called Humankind, which also kind of looks like a Civ game. I don't know to what extent it's like a real Civ, but where's the new Civ? I don't know. Yeah, and those are my play hates and misses.
Yeah, that's good. We got to start the not that different than Skate. Where's the next Civ? At some point maybe it'll come out. But back to the topic that you mentioned, the controversy around it is, this has been a topic for quite some time. It seems like around the cost of games. Some say, why is it so high? Why is it so low? And for us, and part of what I think inspired, and I think it's good for the listeners to kind of hear this, is that recently we've seen a couple of announcements, and then just even through own observations, right? Gears Tactics was €70 on Steam, and we were like, wow, that was a surprise. And then NBA 2K21 has just recently announced that they're going to go $70 USD. And the other part of that too, kind of the confluence of things, is that anytime you see a platform change, you typically see an adjustment in pricing, in large part because the cost of development has been raising in costs, and we'll get into some of that. And presumably it's justifiable. So that said, the big question I think we want all of our kind of take on, and us to kind of have a discussion about is it time for us to raise the price of games? Yes or no, and let's discuss it. So who wants to go first?
I can start off. I think, I would love for games to come up in price. And like we're all on I think a lot of our listeners are game consumers and would love to have the cost of games go down, obviously, so you can buy more games. The three of us are in the games industry, so we enjoy having our paycheck. So having larger revenue streams probably be good. But there's a pretty decent sort of value for money with video games, right? You pay $60 and you get dozens or hours or thousands, hundreds and thousands, maybe not hundreds and thousands, but hours of entertainment from there. And that's kind of hard to beat. With just the cost of making games skyrocketing, like game studios and developers and publishers will try to find maybe more predatory ways of getting you to recoup some of those costs. So I think actually having games cost more will just allow for a more traditional, you buy a game from a store and that supports the developers, and then you can enjoy your games.
So you're in the increased costs.
Yeah.
Okay. Paul, what do you think?
I'm going to play the role of Mike in this one and say
I love that. That's my brand.
Yeah.
You haven't even gotten to me, but yes, I love it. I love it.
No,
yes.
it's so, I look at it very much in shades of gray. And I think that what we should empower developers to do is price their game appropriately for the amount of content that they feel that they're delivering. So if that means you're a Red Dead Redemption or a GTA where there's literally 100 hours of straight storyline gameplay in there, maybe you should charge more for your game versus somebody that offers like a really tight, 6-hour experience. Those two things are not created equally in my eyes, so you shouldn't charge them equally as much. So I think that's, just empower us, or not empower us, but I think that developers should try to take more of that into their own hands and say, how much value do I think I'm packing into this game, and what feels right for the consumer, right for me, so that I can recoup those costs. I think that is going to fluctuate wildly, and I think that if you've seen more that happen on Steam in recent years, thinking about how some mid-tier games come out at like the $20 to $40 price range. And sometimes you see games there, they're like, man, like I got a lot for $20. I played that game for like 100 hours, whereas I paid $60 for some other game and played it for $4. So that value is super flipped. So you feel great about that $20 purchase, but you feel really crappy about the $60 purchase. So I think it really depends on what is in the game and kind of what you're trying to provide in terms of value. But I think that that's going to vary per person, and it's going to be really tricky. But bottom line, I'd say just we should be charging what I think the game is worth more. And if that means increasing the price of your game because you have 800 developers making something for 4 years, then you should think about it.
I love that. I love that it depends really as kind of a yes, maybe. It depends literally. And so if you're going to take my role, then maybe I'm going to take your role because somebody's going to have to. But I think I'm more in that court, which is it depends. I don't think it's as clear cut of an answer, but for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to say no. And here's why. There's a couple of things. One is I think I don't think that raising price really saves us from any predatory pricing or other catch mechanics or other monetization methods that are out there anyway. I don't. Not today, not at this point. That kind of the toothpaste is out of the tube, as I would like to say. It's already kind of out there. I think that there is enough business models at play now, whether it's the hybrid models, free to play, non-traditional, you name it. MTX is floating out there. That in the end run, people will find ways to monetize. And that doesn't necessarily mean the entry price. In fact, keeping it low is probably advantageous, especially considering that you're now in the gaming business getting to economies of scale. And unlike previous platform generations, you don't get to reset the clock anymore, or you don't have to, right? So you're not appealing to 2 million people. You're appealing to 20 million and 30 million, especially with crossplay and everything else, which fundamentally changes the economics, I think. And it helps. And especially when you layer on things like what you just said earlier, even if it's more gimmicky, but like season passes, bundles, there's many ways to monetize outside of that. And so, I don't think so. I think that, $60, in fact, you could make the argument, and you already, kind of see that people are playing with different models to go lower in that. Does that mean that you shouldn't charge more? No, I think people are already doing it though. For the amount of content, when you start layering on post-launch monetization types of things, you are paying $100. If you create deluxe SKUs and other SKU strategies, you are paying $70, $80, $90, maybe $100 to help kind of monetize that. So no, I don't think it's time. And in some ways, I think that, it changes it could potentially change the profitability of a lot of game developers for sure, but that's primarily AAA and doesn't necessarily serve the greater good.
Well,
but that's
smaller studios and developers also publish on the same platforms that the AAA studios ship on as well. So
sure,
that would exclude a lot of probably decent games from ever being made. If you need to cater to an audience in the millions in order to even have a chance, or even to be able to raise capital to make your games. And I think it's also important to point out that we're talking about not mobile games. We're talking about mostly, PC and Xbox and
yeah, it's an important distinction that we're primarily focused on HD games. I think you get into a very different conversation around mobile and even in the PC, but primarily console premium HD games, because that's where we associate that frontline title price.
But I mean, in terms of the span of kind of game development budgets, there's a good article. I did some research before this episode by Raf Koster from a few years ago called "The Cost of Games," where he researches the cost of the increasing cost of video game development. And it's very hard to say because there are studios of 1 or 2 or 3 people and 1, 2, 300 people, right, making games with a wide span of budgets. But what this article kind of points out is that we have, an almost tenfold increase in development costs over a decade, and that seems to be kind of a linear evolution. We're seeing huge sums, and that excludes all of the marketing budget as well, which is usually, almost the same as the development cost. And it would suck for gaming for us to have to exclude a lot of people because we need to cater to mass audiences to be profitable.
I think that's a fair point. Like, there's no question game development has increased, right? Like, there's a interesting stat when I was looking through some of this stuff that in 1993, Doom was largely seen as like the most expensive produced game. And it was $200,000, right? Imagine that in today's world. You're seeing games that are easily 50, 100, $200 million US dollars in development costs. And so there's no question that the production budgets, because you're on the bleeding edge of technology, and that you are always packing more and more technology, and yet you're not increasing in costs in other industries like you do in other industries, like let's call it hardware, where you see some of that. Right? iPhones are $1,000 where they maybe were only $400 or $500 a few years ago. But I just think that the business models that we have to play with are different, right? You could imagine a future, because in fact, if you look at where you make the money, more and more it's shifting away from the entry point that you get access to the game. Even in the console business, I mean, you could imagine a future which says instead of charging $150 as an example, instead of MTX, because I hear you, Paulie, on that one, which is, well, I don't want to charge MTX. What if I charge per minute or per hour of game? $1 per hour. I'll pay 30. I'll pay 100. Maybe, I'm not suggesting that that's the path it would go, but I think that our industry, more than any other, is more open to that level of kind of innovation in business models and monetization than every other industry. And so that entry cost, to me, it doesn't solve the problem around 5-fold increase in cost of development. That doesn't help you. I mean, take $10 US, which is what kind of is being proposed. Half of that goes back to the developer, and probably even half, there's, even while that's 50% profit share, that doesn't really solve a 5x increase in cost of development. So I think it's a little bit kind of fool's gold when it comes to kind of just the higher price of a game. I just think we'll get smarter. Different business models will subsidize game development in different ways.
I think it leaves the player with a lot of soul searching for how do they feel about paying for things, which already happens now, right? Like, a lot of people just say, like, you can tell them to their face that, like, hey, costs have increased massively, but we're still charging you the same amount. So we're collectively, if you wanted to make the argument, we're losing money year over year. Because we could have been making more had we been charging to match the rate of costs that we're expending. And people just look at you and be like, I don't care. That's not my problem.
Yeah.
Like, this is the price. Like, they're used to a thing, and people like consistency, especially with our medium, which is really weird. Because if you look at other industries, you see a lot of stuff fluctuate. Like, I did a little bit of digging in terms of like the music industry. Like, the cost of music has gone up. What was it? 10x after inflation from the time in the 50s up until about the early 2000s. So, like, costs just kept scaling like crazy. But now business models we've seen shifted, and around, the early 2000s was when Napster went under. Then you started to see Apple Music. Spotify came, I don't know how much later, 10 years later, something like that. And there's streaming services. So there's different business models, like you're talking, Mike. A lot of that stuff has spin, but I think for consumers, for some reason, the games industry, they've just been like, this is the price. Like, that's it. Yeah. You can't do more. Like, people get upset when they see that someone is thinking about doing this, which extends to the after launch stuff, the MTX, the DLCs. People are like, I don't like this. I don't feel that this is a fair price. It's really interesting to see consumer behavior around video games specifically. Yeah,
I think there's a couple of comments around that. I think, one, you're right. I think you haven't seen the same level of inflation, although I don't know that you could to get to the same kind of economies of scale, because a lot of our games are based on, we have to get a certain amount of people involved, right? It's with multiplayer gaming in particular. And so you have to kind of keep some of those costs down. You have to get to a certain scale. And I think that's problematic for that. That's also why I think that, people are becoming more creative in business models in our industry because of that, right? So if you imagine a world where we did scale our costs, or let's call the cost of goods, that matched what we actually charged consumers, then you're probably right. We wouldn't have the MTX models. We wouldn't have a lot of the different business models, because those are really just different ways for us to charge money and by choice, but select audiences that are willing to pay. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. I think it is an interesting discussion. I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier to Hans when we were talking just off podcast, and that was, I actually think that the challenge isn't so much charging more. The biggest challenge to gaming and when it comes to price and everything else is the valuation of and non-commoditization of games. And had we been smarter and better about that in the industry, we actually probably wouldn't even be having this conversation. Because I think we've especially even in the move to digital, we've kind of priced ourselves out and had a little bit of, not as bad as movies was, but this race to the bottom, which is heavily discounting, 30 days in, people more aggressive, and part of that is a maturing market. But it also means that you've commoditized games in such a way that people expect to pay less now.
I think that's another really interesting thing. If you think about, I'm going to go back to our scaling cost thing, and you mentioned, needing to reach a large enough scale, specifically for things like multiplayer games. Those are two very different things. If you think about the costs that go into them and the output that players get from them. Multiplayer, if you do like a pure multiplayer game, you can get away with less assets than you would need for a mid-sized single player game. Because single player, people are expecting cut scenes, tons of animation, tons of dialogue. And there is so much more that goes into a single player game behind the scenes from a dev team. And those teams get massive. But for multiplayer, you can get a lot. You can get by with I only need to create one character type. It shares the same animations everywhere. Yeah. We've made one map, and that's about it. You don't have to think about tons of different animations, tons of dialogue, you can cut out so much of the fat. So you can have a smaller team, and you can be more profitable because multiplayer games are stickier. Right?
Yeah, it's the cost. And I want to hear Hans on this too. The cost of, let's call it non-multiplayer, single-player content is so much more. And how do you even think about a business model or charging players for that? Think of a lot of the Bethesda's games.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue. I mean, single-player games with a lot of content are kind of an aberration that probably shouldn't get to live. I've said it before. I don't enjoy these long games because I can't stick with them. But if we look at, so I don't watch a lot of movies either. But the sort of the Marvel stuff that happened in the last few years, I saw Iron Man 1, and it was decent, I guess. But that's, I mean, how many hours of entertainment are we talking spread over a lot? 10, 12, something like that. And what's the cost of seeing those movies, in a sort of deluxe environment? You go to the cinema, it's more than $60, right? For 10 hours or 20 hours of entertainment. Mm-hmm. And then shouldn't we kind of be basing the value proposition on that? It's one kind of baseline that we kind of could talk about. How many hours of entertainment are you going to get out of it? But the cost of making the new sort of HD 4K resolution of games now. I mean, when 3D artists are making assets for video game characters in 2020, they are more detailed and high resolution than cinema assets 15 years ago. Absolutely. And we don't have the same kind of budgets that movies had 15 years ago in video games, or maybe we are, but we're absolutely not kind of pricing them as such. So,
but let's go to that point. So, because I agree with you 100% that is the change, and there's definitely a difference in the way that we consume media and the expectations players have for our media in our industry versus movies, right? Because that argument has been since the dawn of time. It's hard to make sense of it because you're like, well, for 2 hours, I'm paying $20 a head, which is $10 per hour. I assure you, we don't really pay anything like that in games. No. You could have a game that's 100 hours and pay a lot less, or get it off some store shelf for $5, whatever, right? So there's just a whole myriad of different conversations around that. But but raising the price. So, because like I think what we said earlier was it's $60. Let's just assume it's $60 frontline title price. We raise it by $10. Does that really solve the dev side? Because I think that's what you're getting at, right? Which is, I want to solve this, but I don't know that that does.
Well, maybe it would sort of force, because consumers wouldn't. Well, maybe they will, but I'm not thinking this is going to go over well with consumers. If we say, if we adjust for inflation over the last 15 years, if we take $60, it's going to be increased to 80, 81, something like that over the last 15 years. I think I saw that. If we're going to be charging people $80 or $90 per game, there's going to be a revolution. We're going to cut the heads off. But
let's assume it doesn't. Let's say they don't revolt. Everybody says, you know what? This is the most sensible argument Hans has ever made. we're gonna buy it at $80. Does that really help solve the game dev gap like that? Because I think what I've heard, and you guys would know better, is game development has increased 5x. Right?
I think
we're going to increase, just consistent to inflation, which isn't 5x.
Right. Yeah.
So what are we solving?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'd say it helps solve some of the challenges that come with keeping up with tech debt the way that other partner services that you probably hadn't used before you'd be able to maybe take advantage of. I think it allows the team to start pouring more into R&D for future titles, or even just retrofitting an existing title with things. I think that there's a lot of stuff that, when I think about what some games have done, and I think about how they're run specifically more like live service games. So once they're out there, you end up running into a lot of problems where you're like, I can't really solve for this anymore because we need to keep moving forward. And there's problems I wish I could solve, but I don't have the time or resources to go back and do that, because it would mean holding up the entire game for many months at a time. Yeah. And people want content constantly. So maybe you can start to find ways to tackle that problem so that you don't constantly end up with just a trail of bugs or something that keep following you and just keeps getting bigger as time goes on, because you can't get everything. Right. But and it can also be forward looking. Like I said, it allows you to start throwing some R&D into future stuff so you can be more creative, try to push the envelope even more with your next title or the title after that. It could also be, and you know what, and quite frankly, it could just mean that some people in the game industry start getting wages that are a little bit better than they're used to. Like, I know I don't want to speak 100% from a place of knowledge, but I know that I think generally speaking, people feel that QA typically gets underpaid for the amount of work that they do and kind of the level of importance that I feel that they have. So that could be something. You just go into paying your dev team more so that they are, feeling a bit better about coming into work every day. And, that shows itself in the product that you get at the end of the day. I think, it's not just about like, hey, I want to get rich because I have more money. I think, but there's smart ways to treat that money that help the consumer at the end as well.
And
it's an interesting perspective. I didn't think of. Go ahead, Hans, you were going to say something.
Game development is inherently risky because it's a weird. If you're talking about traditional making games, you work on a game, you sell the game in a store, and you get revenue from that. Then that's you're taking a few years off making the game while probably not selling too much of your back catalog, a little bit maybe, but not usually nothing to kind of keep you afloat. And then you're hoping for a good launch, which, you might be launching at the same time as, another game that features cartoony Overwatch style characters or something like that. And you'll have a bad launch. Didn't Crucible kind of get delisted or something like that? Yeah, they had a really bad launch. That sucks because you make most of your money in a traditional kind of game dev situation off of that launch. A few weeks and then that's it.
Yeah. So a couple of things I'm just trying to kind of roll through. Isn't that just the nature of a hit-driven business, though? Right? Yeah. You kind of feast and famine, and so part of that's the nature of it.
Sure. But it would be nice to be able to mitigate risks there.
Sure, we could. But let me ask you this, though. Do you think overall because I'll tell you where I'm going with this. Do you think overall that is gaming healthier today than it was 10, 15 years ago?
I mean, I wasn't around in gaming 10, 15 years ago.
Oh,
On
okay.
the
So
inside,
maybe this is a question I think we are.
Yeah.
I think that 10, 15 years ago, publishers struggled quite a bit to make a profit. I think there was mass contraction with many different publishers like THQ and others going out of business and not doing well because there was AAA and then and some in the indie scene wasn't as strong as it was, and mid tiers just were getting crushed. And so I think today, though, I think part of that is the legitimacy of just having a huge base of many different players. Gaming development kind of growing up and us getting smarter and smarter about it, and then self-publishing taking hold, and has enabled a healthier climate for people to become more successful.
Also,
and so
the audience has increased quite a bit.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So more and more players have yeah, exactly. And so I think that, yeah, I think the worry that I would have, and again, just part of me is just empathizing with this, because I agree with both your comments that if you put more money into gaming and spent the right way, call it wages, call it other things, better distribution and pay, that makes a ton of sense. More into R&D so that you can actually be more in the bleeding edge and you can push the industry farther. I think is all really, I think it's well intended. It still boils down to highly capitalistic. And I think the general kind of belief that I have is that if you raise the price, really you just make gaming more profitable for a lot of the companies that presumably can charge for higher production or for titles that maybe would deserve that. And maybe that's fine, because that's what they do. But I don't know if that really helps move the industry. I don't know if that gets people paid more, which is, I think, the arguments that you guys have kind of put in place.
I think that's a fair point. Like there's always companies out there that are looking to take advantage of people so that they can increase their shareholders' money at the expense of employees. I don't think we're going to get away from that. So it's, that's something I can't plan for. I can't, that's not something I can impact. But I think it's
that, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
But it's a really valid point. It just comes down to, ethics of each individual company. But I would hope that allowing games, I think, to price more for what the developers feel is valuable for their game, and not being criticized for being too high or too low. More so too high, could help those struggling mid tiers or indies to claw their way out of just getting by, as kind of Hans was talking about earlier, or failing. I'm not against, like, I'm without getting too far into like the politics of capitalism and its merits and demerits, but just like I'm all for if something's not good and it doesn't need to necessarily continue on, but I think that people should be given a fair shake, and be compensated for their work appropriately, I guess is the way to put it. Like any other art form.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if this really solves that, right? So we look at that. Indies, I don't see an indie charging €70 or 70.
Right? I mean, there are some games that I think you could argue, like, hey man, I've gotten more out of this indie game than I have out of a AAA game.
Agreed.
So should they have charged more than the $10 that they did? Probably.
Yeah,
but,
and you think that would have made it? I mean, this is a valid point. If you're saying that, I think that if that's who the kind of the target of that conversation is, because I think I envision this. If you raise it, let's just play the hypothetical.
Yeah.
This is always fun, right? We raise it. Everybody, woo! We're raising $70, woo! Everywhere. I think what you would see is AAA and Quad A kind of games $70. That's the new standard.
Mm-hmm.
Indies would be somewhere in the 20, 30 range.
Yeah.
And what it could do is it could move them and give them more spacing, and they would go 20, 30, or 40. That could be true.
Sure.
That could be true. You could say that. That could help.
Mm-hmm.
But I highly doubt that they would go all the way up. And maybe that's enough. And maybe that is all that's needed. I venture to guess that indies, I think, are struggling not because of price point. Or not struggling. I shouldn't say that. There are a lot of successful indie studios. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of not so successful independent studios.
But it's a risky venture.
It's a risky adventure, and I think we've covered some of this before, of how many are not successful. The number one reason they're not successful is because nobody knows about their game. It's not because of price.
Oh, so it's all leading back to marketing now, huh?
Boom, segue to marketing costs.
No, but I think, I think that's the number one. When you look at the number one failure of
Yeah.
those games is because nobody knows about it. It's not price. So again, I go back to, like, I don't think price actually helps in any of this conversation. And even if we carry that forward, let's just say that we adjust the price up. I still would go back to, I think that the bad behavior of not pricing our games, but the way we manage our pricing, discounting, heavily discounting, whether it's on Steam or the fact that right now, the number one reason why people don't pre-order games is because within 30 days, they're going to be dropped in price.
Absolutely.
And so all of that type of kind of treating digital value as something less than physical or worse only helps kind of commoditize our gaming even more. And that doesn't help anybody, right? And so I think I go back to that as part of the reason why I think if we clean that up, I think that would do more than raising price to $70.
Sure. All right. I don't think we're going to solve it today, but I would love to be able to have an increase in price so that maybe Cadence of Hyrule doesn't come out with a season pass. Instead, just sells a DLC or something.
Yeah, for sure. So here's another question. I don't know how deep we're going to go into this because you know how much I geek out on this stuff, and you guys probably at some point need to kind of press the red button. How do we even begin to set pricing? How do you guys think about it with new business models? You got subscriptions, you got free to play, you got MTX, you got. I mean, I think that's both the beauty of being in this business and kind of the one of the most challenging parts of it.
Sure.
I think for me, it is super challenging to figure that stuff out. I think that the tendency, like if you just kind of like broad strokes tendencies, what do you see in the marketplace? Anybody from like some of the major publishers, you can almost guarantee that whatever game they put out, it's going to be the max price that players would accept, $60. For some of the mid-tier publishers that are out there and probably some larger self-published companies, you'll probably see anywhere from like 30 to 60, right? Depending on the scale, the size and scope of the game. And then indies could be anywhere. But typically I'd say that's between like $5 to $30 for an indie title. I don't remember what point I was trying to make. Shit. I was just trying to set the bar, and then I lost what I was going to say while I was setting the table.
Oh boy! Oh
Jesus.
boy!
Say your question again.
I said basically, how do we even think about?
Okay, yeah, right. Sorry, the value proposition. So, I think that when you roll in, so you can just start looking at, okay, what do competitors in my space do? What has kind of been generally accepted amongst other games that are of the type and scale that I'm building? So you can gotta get a sense from the marketplace. What are people willing to pay for? What feels right to them for something that's similar?
But
so
and then you undercut them.
Let me ask. Sorry, you were going to finish your point. I thought.
Yeah, I was going to keep. I'm setting the table. I'm still going, but
you're still going.
Like that wasn't the answer. So that's a point. That's a thing that you can do, but that just means that all you're doing is relying on what are the values that have been brought and just kind of carried through over the last like 30 years of game dev that haven't changed. So the value that people are attributing anything is nothing. It's just arbitrary. There is no standard for how do I price my game. It's literally based off like 12 factors, and you're just like, so-and-so did this. Well, this guy did this. I don't know. I feel we're somewhere over here, so let's just go with that. It's way too arbitrary. There's not like the golden rule of it's $1 an hour of gameplay. It's nothing like that.
I know.
But that's why when you do those comparisons from like a game to a movie to a TV show to music, it's all over the fucking place.
Or even based on production costs, like any other product. You know, we spend
what you have to charge.
Right, exactly.
I know. Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's an interesting discussion because I think there's a whole kind of host of variables that go into that crucible to kind of come out that says, okay, here's what it is. Whether it's cost of the development, what our profitability targets, to what we think the game is. I think part of me was more interested in not just like how we price it, but in this new world where you're going to have subscriptions play a bigger part. And I think I'm going to point back to this example that we started with, which was Gears Tactics, €70 or whatever it was on Steam, and then Xbox Pass free. There's such a big dichotomy there. And maybe some of that was intentional by Microsoft. I don't know, and I don't want to begin to speculate.
I will.
They can speculate on how intentional that was, but because it could have been, but it just you could potentially see more and more of that, right? As you see like the different pricing models based on different entry points into the game, and that as a consumer is to me it's fascinating because you're like, well, do I want to go pay €70 for Gears Tactics, or do I want to pay what does Gears Pass? What, $5, $10,
$15, right?
$15 a month, I think, for Game Pass Ultimate.
The it goes to show how much I'm paying per month. Maybe I should review the charge. But anyway, it's like, okay, or do I pay? I mean, the math just makes a ton of sense, and I know that that's the intention behind it, and it's really smart on their behalf. But then I don't even know how that plays in everyone's psyche, because you're like, well, I'm going to get access to that, and then at some point, do I pay $20, $30, and then there you go. But it is an interesting kind of proposal when it comes to how do I even think about pricing the game and where do I get my sales.
And I think the comment you brought up about Gears Tactics being in part of Game Pass versus a standalone product. So as a consumer, as a developer, when I think about doing that, you're like, okay, well, when I sell the game, that's guaranteed revenue that I understand. I don't know what the business model behind Game Pass is. So if I sell 2,000 copies of the game, I'm like, okay, well, that's not a lot. But it's like, yeah, but you got 100 million players playing it via Game Pass for free. Right. You're like, okay, but how much money do I actually get from that? Depending on whatever the deal, it's different because they're a first party thing. So, which is a completely different thing that I can touch on in a second. But like, if you're a third party developer and you're just like, well, okay, well, what am I getting paid on? What is the business model behind the Game Pass wall? Yeah. Between the consumer and myself, how does that transaction work? Because $15 a month, and you're like, well, there's all these other games. How do they all get paid if we're all
not
listening
a ton
together?
of money for that catalog, and it's going to be the Spotify model, which is what I'm afraid of. And I mean, famously, the Spotify model does not work for artists. They get pennies.
They get paid nothing.
Get nothing, but they get to tour. Well, they before the apocalypse, they could tour and make their money back. I can't tour. I got no skills. I got got nothing.
And then jumping back to the Gears thing with being behind Game Pass and it being a first party title owned by Microsoft, they don't necessarily have to worry about that stuff. You know, like maybe it ties into bonuses or something, but like, they're guaranteed a job.
At the end of the day, I mean, they have a very different motivation than let's call it an independent developer, which is always a consideration, right? They want to sell more units, get more sockets for more console players, more subscriptions.
Yeah.
I want to touch on one other point, though. I think I'm a little surprised we didn't spend more time on, and I actually think it would help in the price conversation. And that is the one thing that I love about games, not the one thing, but one of things, right? Is that we're always on the kind of the bleeding edge of technology, and that's always understated, though, and how much technology that we end up packing into our games. You said it earlier, which is like this, the cinematic quality of some of our characters are better than, the movies and everything else. And it's just, we underplay that, I think, from a marketing standpoint. And that is that like the amount of technology that we pack in, every release pushes technology forward. We're always doing something to kind of push that envelope. And you would think in any other industry, right? The tech industry, you charge more for that.
Sure.
Full stop. Like you pack that technology in. That's part of the reason why you buy the next thing. And we really don't talk about that. It's a very emotional experience for us because it's the fusion of art and technology. So we're really not, and we in some ways undersell the technology.
Hot take, or spicy. So I think when Last of Us 2 came out, people were geeking out over the rope technology that they added to the game. Right? People are like, oh man, realistic rope physics, and people are blowing their minds. So Mike, for you, that is a huge leap forward in technologically in terms of able to, make that happen like under the hood. That's really impressive. Yeah. I'll be honest, for me as a consumer, I don't give a shit. That is uninteresting to me completely. And I think for me, like again, this is really personal. Like I'm like, that is a waste of time and resources that I could have spent elsewhere that had an actual gameplay value. That seems like that's a novelty. How much did it cost for a novelty? Like that's the trade-offs I start making in my head. So like, I get your point, but I think there's things that like people push in terms of tech, but it's purely hubris. Right. It's like, look at me do a cool thing. I'm like, that's nice. I don't.
Yeah, it's unfortunate too, because I think you're right. Like if there's no payoff and it's just technology for the sake of technology, it falls flat. And it's like there has to be a handshake between technology with purpose that pays off in the art, and that is the design side of it. When done well, it's a beautiful thing that you can really.
And that you right now, we're having. I mean, RTX. It's such a weird buzzword, ray tracing, right? Which
Yeah.
is going to be the revolution in video graphics. Like it's, I'm not still not seeing any really good examples of how this is impactful for me as a gamer, and it's kind of a big
It's pretty
marketing
marketing.
thing, purely marketing.
Yeah, and I think this is so. I've had this conversation with a lot of people who are artists, and I'm sure if they see this, they're going to yell at me like they always do whenever I touch on this stuff. But I think that like there are definitely things that, like you just said, like RTX, like for me, for the average consumer, I'd say on average, not going to notice a difference. Like they might just be like, this looks pretty, but they couldn't describe why or know the reason behind why it looks pretty. High-end, very specific users that follow this thing that are like art nerds will be like, I understand why, I understand what this brings, and I can appreciate that value. But that is a sub-segment of your total audience, and they are in the minority. However,
Most people
you could
willing
make the
to pay
argument
more for RTX stuff.
exactly. So, do you charge more for the tech, like Mike was saying? Oh, it comes full circle.
Well, maybe that's the solution. Throw some tech on it, and then.
But I think
we'll
it's like you said. It depends on what the thing is. I think. Yeah.
I don't know what the right answer is there. I just think it's an observation, right? That I think
That's a
we've
good
always
one.
been at that kind of epicenter of both art, technology, and technology is always underplayed. And I think you make a good point, which is I don't give a shit about technology. Some of the best games I've ever played are just really well designed, and so why do I care about technology?
Yeah.
And I think that's
and I think
a
you
huge
can't
topic.
have. But at the same time, I don't think you can have one or the other, and then how do you kind of play it up? But that's more of a marketing problem.
Mhm.
So where do you think? Like, I think we had some good discussion around like good, bad, indifferent. I think there's some interesting kind of models. I'd love for us to kind of at some point think about like how do we charge people? Is there unconventional ways? The dollar per hour, but that's not very kind of feasible. There's some other crazy stuff. But where did we end up? Any change in minds, or do we end in the same place that we did?
I don't know, man. I just want to stir some controversy. But then again, I think that, I mean, just the fact that the inflation is a factor, and we're paying less for games now. We should probably charge more, right?
I think, do you think that you said this earlier, but I want to revisit it. Do you think that players would ever be receptive to a more transparent dialogue around the economics of games, game development, everything else as a way, or to your point, Paulie, is it like, I don't give a shit?
I think it's just like everything else in the world. It is so hard to talk about nuance, and that is lost on. If you look at your broad swath of audience, most of them will be like, "Don't care, bro. $60.
Care.
That's
Yeah.
it. End of the day."
I only
But
read
there will
that.
be, but there would be a minority that are like, "I understand it and I appreciate the transparency. You know what? I'm willing to support you." And I think that you see that a lot with indie games. A lot more of them are very vocal, are very communicative about like what happens with them, what they go. And you see that they have very engaged, highly passionate audiences that if something comes out that developer is willing to sell as like an add-on or something else, that community, more so than just the minority, like a majority will flock to it and spend money on that thing because they feel good about supporting it.
Sure.
And I think that talks a lot about the digital or the social media age where people feel that connection with the company, which is a weird thing in and of itself. And also touches on a bit of our industry being very two-way street in terms of communication versus other entertainment industries. Yeah. So I think that there is room for there, and I think we're slowly trending that way. And whenever game devs bring that stuff up with their audiences, I always kind of silently like get happy and like kind of like, yes, that's great. Let's continue that. So I don't think change will come quick unless something catastrophic happens, like an EA or an Ubisoft or an Activision's like, we're going to charge $90 per game, YOLO.
Yeah.
Like otherwise, I think it'll be a slow trickle and it'll happen from the ground up with indies and their approach. So I don't know.
You mean in their transparency and how?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. I think it's difficult when you get to the level of the Ubis and the EAs and the Activisions to actually even start talking about economics without getting kind of skewered.
Yeah.
So I think I'm still in that court, by the way, I think there are other ways to make money. I don't think it solves it by increasing price of frontline titles. I think people get more clever with how we actually do it. I think it's a problem, though. You guys cited the, let's call it non-multiplayer, non-MTX games. What do you do there? Those are some of the most expensive types of games, and that is probably the one exception that maybe you should charge $120 for the next Skyrim.
Or, I don't know, like the Final Fantasy remake.
Maybe not Skyrim's not a good example, but something along those lines.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's like chopping stuff up and making it episodic, like what they're doing with the Final Fantasy remake. There are different, not just business models. You can still be a pretty traditional business model. Just like do something about the content you're working on. Put out a season.
I don't know. It's really challenging, like you said, with those single player games, Mike, because that's where the most of the costs are. And I remember some years ago I saw an article where someone was amazed at the fact that people haven't stopped making single player games yet, because they're like, the economics of this doesn't make sense. Why would you continue to do this when multiplayer games are clearly the way forward? But everyone always falls back to the argument is like, but people love those experiences. That's, I think, a lot of those type of narrative driven games and some of the earlier games that didn't maybe have as much narrative, but were just super gameplay focused. That's what drew people into gaming. I think people want to have that emotional reaction to a game on a narrative level, storytelling, where you're embodying a player and doing all these things. So there's always going to be an audience for that, but it's really hard to how do you monetize on that appropriately for the costs?
Yeah, it's tough. I don't have a good answer there. That's the truth. I mean, and crowdsource, maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
Kickstart everything.
Yeah, it's not a good answer, but I don't. Yeah, so I think that kind of wraps up a lot of the.
We're not going to solve it tonight.
not going to solve it tonight as
tomorrow,
much.
Though we got
tomorrow, it. I know. Maybe tomorrow, well, chapter 2, but the one thing though, so that kind of closes that segment out, and that moves us into that's fucking cool, right?
Right.
Do you guys have something for that's fucking cool?
I do.
I have a small thing, so it's not all that exciting.
Go ahead then.
Oh,
kick us off, Mike.
Oh, boy.
It's small. We'll build.
We'll build. I won't be the closer. So here's the thing. When I've been biking in Sweden, I put my helmet on, everything else, and every time I go through, there's everybody that's much cooler than me has the ABS helmets, which is pretty damn cool, right? They have
the collar.
Yeah, so it's and I honestly didn't even know what it was until somebody pointed it out, I think about a year ago, and said, yeah, it's an ABS. You can pick it up. It's basically if you fall, it deploys an airbag around your head and saves you, which is kind of cool, right? For a guy that's so concerned about his hair. Clearly my hat. So I was watching last night. I was watching a show. It's not Warren Miller, but it reminds me of all the Warren Miller ski films. It was just a documentary on Netflix and extreme sports. And it was everything from 100 meter, maybe it was 25 meter waves to extreme skiing, and there was a suite on there. So of course I was just watching this, and in there, one of the skiers took a tumble in an avalanche, like an avalanche had taken them over, and their ABS had deployed. And I just thought, and last night, that was just cool, right? Like the fact that, one of the biggest fears when you're in that climate is that you're going to get trampled by an avalanche. And oh, by the way, you have an ABS that just deploys. And it turns out that that's actually becoming really popular in a lot of extreme sports, whether it's big extreme snowboarders and everything else, but having airbags, self-deployed airbags on your body. And I just thought, how fucking cool is that?
That is fucking cool.
You see these, speed, I don't know if they're putting it on speed skiers yet, but that would save you, that it would instantaneously, that technology would save you. But I guess not surprised. Cool. So that's fucking cool. What about you guys?
That stuff would just deploy for me instantly. Like I'm 10 minutes down to, and then I'm down the slope and then falling over and
it's preemptive deploy. Like, don't go down the
mountain. But I saw a couple of days ago, Microsoft announced that their Project xCloud, their streaming platform, would be supported by Xbox Game Pass. So if you pay the $15 Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, you would also have access to that catalog on the streaming service, which is what I've been waiting for, because Stadia it's not the minimum viable product. It's not even viable at all, basically. So finally, cloud gaming is here, and I can't wait. We talked about this last week with Shadow, which is a little bit of a different kind of technical implementation of it. But I'm actually just really looking forward to being able to play games on my TV or my phone or my tablet or my computer that I don't have to like download and install and anything.
So this is like the first time, because like we've been all waiting for this, right? Like there's subscription, cool. Cloud, cool.
Yeah.
When do you combine them together?
Exactly.
And
it makes a lot of sense.
And it's just a matter of time. Although I don't know. We'll see how that kind of plays out in terms of installation and everything else. But that to me is like, that's when I get really excited, because you get to do both, right?
Sure. And I think that's kind of the only reasonable way to pay for cloud games. But all right, that's my fucking cool. I like it. I think it's cool.
Nice.
I think that's cool.
Mine is highly topical to today's episode. So Mike, like you, I was watching a Netflix documentary within the last week, and this one was on the business of drugs. And the first, I think the first episode in this series, they talk about the price of cocaine having stayed consistent over the last like 40 years. And in the documentary, they call out the fact that nothing else has really done this except video games. And then they drew a graph of the price point of, I think it was like a gram of cocaine versus video games.
Right.
And the prices have just been like consistently flat for like 30, 40 years. And I was wonderful. Like, oh, great. Yeah, we're good. Video games industry right up in there with the drug trade. That's great.
So how many hours of entertainment are you going to get from $60 of cocaine? I don't know. What's the value prop on that one? I
don't know, man. They didn't get into that. Should have asked that question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I just thought that was hilarious. So when I saw it, I kind of just lost my shit. I'm like, that's great.
I love that was part of your research going into this episode.
I don't know.
That's good. I dig it. That's probably the only way to close then.
I think so. Well, it's been a long one, and but I think at least I enjoy this conversation, and I think we need to talk a lot more about this. And the last word has not been said about pricing in games. All right.
Not yet.
All right. Cool. Thank you, guys. Stay safe out there. Thank you all for listening. If you want to see more episodes of this podcast, please check out patchandcrash.com. Also, follow us on Twitter @patchandcrash, where we post about new episodes or live streams.